Hey everyone, thank you for watching my first video. This will be a 3-part series. In this series, I'll take you on the process of taking this character from a base mesh to a more finished character with texturing and rigging. This is the first character that I've got this far along in the process, so I wanted to share it with all of you. This is a base mesh that I built previously for this type of character. So at the beginning, I just focus on larger details and don't get too far into minor details. You do that later on in the process. And here you can see I'm using a draw tool with a strength of 0 just to add detail to the mesh itself without changing the shape of it, which will allow me to put finer details in later. I just do it at the beginning so that I know the level of detail I have to work with. Here I'm trying to get the general shape of the character to match what it will end up being. It came from a model that was a little bit different of a build, so I have to adjust the mesh to be the right shape. At this point you can see I like to add a lot of extra detail by drawing out more than I need, and then I use smooth tools and negative drawing tools or drawing strength of 0 to bring the entire area back down all at once. Yeah, here soon I'll do a video where I start off with a blob to sculpt with instead of a base mesh. There you can see the overdraw and then correct by smoothing technique. One of the fun things about making characters that are, well, not standard is that you have to come up with ways to tie in different pieces that don't really exist. For example, a lot of the muscle detail in this model is not related to purely human anatomy. Throughout this video, there's different times you can see the reason that I like to use a lot of extra detail when I sculpt. Basically, I add a whole lot more points than I need, and then I found that over time using just the draw tool with a strength of 0 and negative sign is a really easy way to change the mesh and kind of make the points more consistently spaced without actually retopologizing. So even for texturing, I've been able to get away with what they call a dirty mesh more than I would be able to if I hadn't cleaned it up. But it's a lot faster than rebuilding the mesh in a retopology, which we'll have to do later for animation anyway. So on this part, I'm starting to get into a little bit of smaller detail, but I want to make sure at this stage that I have enough detail for later. And if I need to add any extra smaller geometry, it's easier to just have consistent spacing in your vertices early on. Here you can see making a lot of use of the grab tool. Alright, at this point I've got a lot of the general details set up, so I'll start to do a little bit more fine detail. Also doing things like adding the head and any other additional sculpting details that are needed. And you can see I added some reference images. Here, this is more like what making the base mesh would look like. I start with just blobs that I can reshape using the sculpting tools. And the images are just more or less to trace to get the general form down. I like to call it 3D tracing because you can align images in different directions and then just look right through your mesh to match it to the image. Obviously at this part, it just shows that you can't really rely on the 3D tracing methods. At some point you have to kind of infer the geometry on your own. Here I'm trying to use the X-ray view, which lets you look through the mesh, but it doesn't have enough opacity, so I couldn't see through to the reference image, so I copied it off to the side just to be able to use it while I was sculpting. On these smaller parts of the mesh, especially things like eyes and ears and horns and the nose there, I like to add a whole lot of extra geometry because you can always decimate the model later and remove points that you don't need. Here I'm adding another meta ball is what it's called, but it's another blob that I can use to sculpt the neck. And in future videos I'll show how to combine all of these pieces into one mesh. Using different parts is convenient because it lets me sculpt the details in together without worrying about how the seam will tie in. So I can ignore trying to line up vertices or anything like that and just sculpt the shape that looks right. Obviously you can see at this point, even though the head and the neck are new parts of this mesh, they're too small to just be general detailing at this point. So basically the smaller the objects, the more detail you have to start with. But things like eye sockets and the nose shape in general are the best to start with. And then you work into finer details. Here I'm bouncing between the mesh of the body and the mesh of the neck, and just using the sculpting tools to be able to line them up before I combine them. If you can get the two to look similar at this point instead of later on when you try to combine them, it's a lot easier to hide the seam later and correct the geometry where it changes. So watching these videos back, one thing I realize is that even in areas where general details might be done, you're never necessarily done modifying one part of the mesh at any given point. So I do bounce around a lot, and I come back and change the general shape. Well, this is gonna wrap it up for part 1. This is most of our general sculpting. Part 2 is gonna be more fine detail, and we'll get into some texturing.